Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another session of Room for Discussion. It's the second last session before the end of the year, and it's great to have you all today because we've got a very special guest here today. It's the prominent Australian economist Steve Keen. He's the head of the economics department at Kingston University in London. He's also the author of the book Debunking Economics, and he's a strong critic of mainstream economic thinking. He's also known to be one of the few economists that have predicted the global financial crisis. Today we'll be discussing with him his critique on mainstream economics, the problem of holding a vast amount of private debt, the solution to this problem according to him, and finally we'll finish with some predictions on future financial crises in certain countries. It's good to note that you can also ask audience questions. This can be done at the back with my colleague Valentina, she's holding the mic, and also on Twitter using the hashtag RFD. For now, please give a warm applause to our guest, Steve Keen.
Thank you. Okay.
Professor Keen, again, welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. You are here for Rethinking Economics.
That's
what
right.
will you exactly be doing for them here in Amsterdam?
Well, they want me to talk about how, if you actually want to teach something other than just teaching neoclassical economics, what's your curriculum going to be? So a fair amount of talking about how would you actually teach without having like a accepted canon, which is the neoclassical canon. How would you do that and teach other approaches as well and make it comprehensible to the students, which is a challenge without a doubt. We're trying it at Kingston, but it's not an easy thing to do.
And are you doing this mainly with other professors from the UvA then, or is it from the University of Amsterdam specifically that you're talking with?
I'm getting the person who can answer that question is sitting in the front row. He's shaking his head.
Okay, that's clear. So this change, should it come mainly from the students, from the professors, or is it really that the students need to?
In terms of Kingston, Kingston's always been a place where the non-orthodox economists have had a foothold, like a guy called Paul Auerbach. Right. And Paul actually retired at the university last year after being there for 44 years. Yeah? So he's always been somebody who's interested in a sort of humanist stroke Marxist sociology approach to economics. He's been teaching that all the way through. Other staff like Engelbert Stockham have been there for a number of years. So they had a background of being non-orthodox, and then when they were looking for a head of school, which I no longer am, by the way, okay. I pulled out of that. I found that the advantage of being head of school is you get the really exciting job of approving people's taxi receipts. Right. Which wasn't my idea of fun, so I sort of took a step back from that. But they wanted somebody who'd taken them in a different direction, and I said, well, I'm going to try to make you the strongest pluralist university economics department in the world.
Okay, but
which wasn't all that hard, unfortunately.
But around, like, in other universities, do you think the change needs to come from students specifically, or the professors?
The change won't come from the staff.
Okay.
And most of the leading universities, it won't come from the staff because you'll always get a few staff who go through the metamorphosis of believing neoclassical economics, doing a PhD in the area, and at some point going, what the hell am I done? You know? And then they flip and they'll either become Austrian or Marxist. It depends, you know, you're almost like a toss of the coin. So you'll get that spontaneous generation of a criticism within the department. But then what happens is somebody who used to be regarded as a, you know, maybe a leading light suddenly becomes a pariah inside that department still, because the majority of staff will still be neoclassical. So if you're going to get real change, it's going to come from the students.
Right. Okay.
Great. Diving straight in there to your critique, we know you're a strong critic of the mainstream economic thinking. And this always comes out in your interviews, your blog especially.
Yeah.
Would you say there's also good things about the mainstream economic thinking, or is it all just rubbish?
People keep on asking me that one. And, you know, what would you keep of neoclassical economics if you went forward? And the only answer I can really give that makes any sense is says, what did Copernicus keep of Ptolemaic astronomy?
What did he?
The observations. Right. That was it. And even that, you wouldn't be just keeping the observations of neoclassical economics, because a lot of things are observing things that don't matter in the real economy. Like Nehru, for example, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. That's a fantasy. Some of the important data they should be looking at, fortunately they record, because people like Copeland were involved in designing the flow of funds in America, and he kept detailed records of financial data. So but that isn't part of economic theory. So when you change your perspective from saying, taking the Copernicus example, from saying the Earth is the center of the universe and the sun and the moon and stars rotate us around it, to saying when the sun is at, well, there's not much you can keep. You know? So I'd keep the belief in that you're trying to analyse the economy. And when I talk to neoclassical economists, a lot of my political science people say, oh, they must be doing this because they're being, paid to do it. And I say, no, they genuinely believe this stuff. And they genuinely believe they're doing the right thing. And there's no lack of sincerity there, but I think there's a lack of perception.
Just for the record as well, we've got some non-economic students here in the audience as well. Could you give the key cornerstone or assumption on the mainstream economics, just so we're all on the same
Well, it's fundamentally seeing capitalism as a system that enables people to specialise and barter and trade what their specialisations are. So getting efficiency out of specialisation and then seeing the economy reaching an equilibrium and emphasising equilibrium and the capacity to find a situation which maximises the welfare of everybody, given their trades off with, so nobody loses overall. It's sort of a win-win situation within the constraints of the current capacity to produce. That's the fundamental vision they have of capitalism. And when you look at so many elements of it, it's like, well, what would be an ideal social system? And to define what that ideal social system is, and we're going back to the 19th century when it began, the real question was, can a set of markets can traders in a set of markets reach an equilibrium set of prices that ensures supply equals demand in all markets? And that was both a technical question and also a vision of an ideal society, because if you reach that equilibrium, then you achieved a social harmony with no government. Yeah. And there's this anarchist side to neoclassical economics that I don't think they're particularly aware of, but it ends up being a reason why so many of them are anti-government, because their model says you reach equilibrium without government.
But they don't reach equilibrium, right?
No.
That's what you're saying. That's the main critic.
Yeah, I mean, one of the many criticisms, but if you look at what's actually involved, when Walras wrote his principles, what he had was the idea of you got to start from a random set of prices. So everybody's in this room. The idea he had was based on the Paris Bourse. And the idea was there were individual commodities which were traded by having all buyers and sellers turn up, and then you'd shuffle until you reached equilibrium in that specific market. Right. And what Walras thought, well, if you make it all markets in one room, can you achieve the same outcome? So the idea would be you'd all coming in, you'd all have your pigs and fish and whatever those sandwiches were,
You can't, right? That's what you're saying.
Well, the process he worked out was an iterative process. Start from a random set of prices, find which markets are above and below equilibrium, move the prices down and up, and he thought the direct movements which would make each market move towards the equilibrium would be stronger than the ones which were indirect, would make it move away. Right. And only in the 1910s, 1920s, as mathematicians, completely by accident, proved that wasn't right. What's called the Perron-Frobenius theorem showed that if you have the matrix you use to define that interaction of buyers and sellers in multiple markets is a matrix of positive numbers, positives or zeros. Nobody says, I'm going to give you one negative fish plus so many. Right. No, you've got to have a positive fish or zero fish. And the properties of that matrix were that the equilibrium was unstable. Either when you define it, you had to have two things. The quantities and the prices had to be stable. If you had the matrix which defined both stabilities, the matrix and the matrix inverse both had to have the property of being converging to equilibrium, which they'd only do if what's called the dominant characteristic, called eigenvalue, was negative. Right. What the mathematicians proved, the dominant eigenvalue of a matrix, a semi-positive matrix, is positive. Therefore, the characteristic number is like a single number that's like says, what does this matrix do? Where does it push you? Does it push you away or pull you towards equilibrium? And the matrix, if the dominant value for the matrix was, say, negative, then you'd have one would have a minus, say, 0.5, or the inverse of that is going to be minus 2. Okay. But if the inverse of 1 was plus 0.1, the other inverse of that would be 10. So below 1 was the stability point. So you'd necessarily had to have one or the other unstable. So Walras' scheme doesn't work.
Okay, very short. So equilibrium just don't.
It's unstable.
You will never reach equilibrium.
It's unstable.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
So how would your models then look like? How do you include debt, money, and banking? Yeah. How does that change any?
Dramatically, because for a start, when you have the idea of a barter economy, it's only the goods themselves that are necessary to exchange. You don't have, and when they talk about money, they treat money as a numeraire. You know, it's like a measuring stick. You don't make more measuring sticks. But if you have a monetary economy, which is what we actually live in, then the amount of money itself plays a major factor in whether the economy grows or shrinks. And when you have money being created by banks, they actually expand demand when they create that debt, and when the debt's paid down, that demand's destroyed at the same time. So you get instability coming out of the financial system as well as instability out of the production system. So that's not a bad thing. You know, instability in its own right is actually can be a creative force.
But in that sense, would you say that aggregate demand or GDP can only increase due to extra money supply created by the banks?
It's by fundamentally the way it does increase, because you could actually get more demand by turning over the amount of money more rapidly.
Velocity, the Fisher equation.
But that, in fact, when you look empirically at it, its velocity in America has been falling, and falling quite sharply ever since 1980.
So you're saying that the money supply always needs to increase to increase aggregate demand. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right. So the velocity has always been falling. That's what you say.
Not always, but empirically it's been falling for the last 40 years.
All right, but if we were to say that the velocity would increase, then the money supply can stay stable, and you would still have aggregate demand that's going up, right?
Yeah, but it tends to be a very trivial amount, because money only, like if you look at the maximum rate of velocity of money, it was about 4. What's called the velocity of money of zero maturity, which is an index a friend of mine actually invented. That was maximum 4, it's now down to about 1. Now, to get the sort of change in output we had from when it was 4 to when it was 1, like from 1980 to now, you'd need to have gone from a velocity of 4 to a velocity of 60. Okay? It just doesn't happen. No economy on the planet has grown in terms of aggregate physical output without also growing in terms of the amount of money in its existence. And then therefore the question of how money is created becomes vital, and it's completely either mashed up or ignored by mainstream economics.
Okay. And these factors such as money, debt, the financial institutions, is this a sort of extension on the more mainstream economic models that already existed, or is this a whole new model altogether?
Whole new model, and it drives me balmy that it has to be a whole new model, because it's so bleedingly obvious when you put it together into a model. Like if you look at the vision that the mainstream have, says that banks are just intermediaries.
Right.
Banks enable, you want to lend me some cash, then they say, okay, here's a person who wants to borrow some money, you lend it to him, we'll charge you a fee for the privilege. And all that means is you're shuffling money from one bank account, one deposit account to another deposit account. So one deposit account
just cancels out.
Yeah, they cancel out. It's like a seesaw.
Right.
And therefore, there's no, banks are just facilitators. They're like a lubrication in an engine. They're not actually part of the fuel. But what we say from the post-Keynesian point of view, which is once the realism has come, they provide the fuel. Banks are not they're not intermediaries, they're originators. Right. They actually loan in the first instance.
So by creating that money, they create aggregate demand increase.
Yeah, I mean, it's pardon me being a bit facetious here, but it's the vision that the neoclassicals have is like the banks like Ashley Martin. They introduced two people who want to together. Okay, well, what they actually like is a bit like the red light district. They supply it, and they create the money. By simply lending, and it's
not just an intermediary role.
Not an intermediary. They provide.
Yeah.
Okay.
Clear. I think we got that clear. So you already mentioned the empirical data as well. How vital that is. Why do you believe that is so vital, and why do you think that mainstream economists believe that the rational theory is the starting point, and why do you believe that empirical data is the starting point?
They have built. We're sitting in the perfect analogy to a neoclassical economics laboratory, an armchair. Okay? You sit here and you hypothesize what is an ideal social system.
Right.
And like my favorite instance of that is a book that a lot of economists of my generation learnt their advanced micro from, by a guy called Hal Varian, Microeconomics. I don't have any victims of Hal Varian's book here? Okay. There is not one empirical fact in that book, period. I checked again. Not one. It's all armchair stuff, okay? Right. And that means that if your initial deductive starting point is correct, then okay, you can build the whole structure of society without needing to look at it. But you don't know that it's correct, okay? If it's wrong, when it is wrong, then you build a totally elaborate structure because it's completely irrelevant to the world you're trying to model.
Right. Okay, but still, empirical data has its flaws as well, right? I mean, it isn't without flaw.
Oh, well, it's the empirical data I'm talking about is not econometrics or stuff like that. It's actually going to say, what do firms do? What do people do when they shop? And when you take a look at it, then the mental constructs...
So it's more behavioral economics.
Yeah, well even like how a factory is organised. I mean, if everybody... You know the idea of supply and demand curves. The rising supply curve is entirely derived from the concept of diminishing marginal productivity, where you have a fixed amount of capital and you add a variable amount of labour to it. And that's how you get, that's what gives you both the increased output, but also increased output at a higher cost per unit, because you're getting less output of each additional variable input. When those arguments were shown to factory managers in dozens and dozens of empirical surveys, they basically laugh. In fact, one classic survey guy, a couple of academics called Eitman and Guthrie, they sent a survey out to business people where they drew 8 diagrams of what the cost curves could look like, short-run cost curves. And one of those diagrams is specifically like the one you'll see in textbooks. There were 334 replies to the survey. One, I think it was, of the 300 chose that diagram.
Right.
So in other words, if you set that as a question for university students, only the university students that passed would have chosen that diagram. Gave it to the people who actually ran factories, they all would have failed the economics exam for not knowing how factories work. So what you see with the factories, and if anybody's worked in a part-time job, you know what I'm talking about. The factory has a set of production lines, and the production lines, if you don't have enough work to employ the production lines, you don't use the machinery. So you tend to have, as that work expands, like Christmas comes along and more output comes out of that, then you expand the number of lines you're using. And you'd never get to the stage where you have 2 people operating 1 jackhammer. But the neoclassical theory effectively says, as you keep on getting more and more work, you go from 1 person operating 5 jackhammers to 3 people collectively operating 1 jackhammer. It's nonsense. You have a constant ratio of labour to capital until you reach capacity. But if you haven't started building a new factory by the time you get to that stage, you're a bad manager. So what you get is a linear relationship between inputs and outputs. You don't get diminishing marginal productivity and rising marginal cost. In fact, you have falling marginal cost.
Right.
So empirically, the starting point they start from is something that you derive from an armchair.
Yeah.
Don't ever actually even think about intellectually its own weaknesses, and then you try to analyse capitalism
but
using...
So you start from the armchair, you start from the rational theory, and then you look for the evidence, the empirical data to support it.
I'd go the other way. You look at the empirical data, see what
and then you draw the conclusions from it.
And then you say, how can I model this? You know, what
right,
type...
model it, but you don't draw the conclusions from it, do you?
No, you take a look at it's a combination of inductive and deductive reasoning, okay? But if you don't look at the system itself, you have to have, I mean, Popper's point was that you have to have a theory to do your observation, but the theory itself evolves in a conflict with the observation over time until you finally get something which you have a reasonable correspondence, which is what physics has done for the last 300 or 400 years. But economics, I mean, my favourite instance of how little they look at empirical data is the last person to look at the cost structures of firms was Alan Blinder. Now, I don't know how many people know Alan Blinder's run.
No. When was that?
Yeah, it's 1998, and he was at the time, he was Deputy President of the Federal Reserve. Right. And Deputy President as well of the American Economic Association. It's absolute mainstream. He did a huge survey which involved looking at the cost structures of 15% of America's GDP. It was a giant survey. PhD students did the questioning, absolutely lay down misere argument that showed this is a truly good empirical study. He found that 89% of firms had declining marginal cost, constant or declining.
Constantly.
Pardon?
Just constantly, a
constant marginal or declining. Therefore, he said whether they understood our questions or not, and they were explaining by PhD students were explaining the questions, so hopefully they understood them. He said it paints a picture of the average firm vastly different to what we have in our textbooks. Right. Now that book, if you go on Amazon America, you'll find it has 1 review versus a Maskell micro, which has 110 reviews. Okay. Guess who wrote the review? Me. Okay? I think I'm the only economist who's read the book.
But then again,
they just ignore it because it doesn't reach the conclusion they want it to reach.
But then again, so these findings and your critique on this neoclassical economic theory,
Yeah.
You've written this book, Debunking Economics, in 2001. And since then, we've seen the global financial crisis. Have you seen more support for your theory
I came out with
since,
I came out with the second edition in 2011.
Yeah.
So, and because the fact that the students were organising Rethinking, there's much more support from the student body. And there are a number of, like I'm finally seeing, and I've got to take my hat off to some mainstream economists now, because just in the last few months, you finally see...
Any prominent mainstream economists that have endorsed you?
Koshal Lakota,
Right.
he was the president of the Minneapolis Fed. He was a freshwater economist, as they call them, ultra mainstream.
Okay.
Now he's actually gone right across, and he's actually saying the whole thing has to be restarted. Olivia Blanchard,
Right.
Not that I'm saying he's particularly happy about it.
But that's very recent, right? He turned like a year to 2 years ago.
Yeah,
He
and also,
he was a prominent man that endorsed the austerity politics.
and he's still pushing the theoretical stuff.
okay.
And then Paul Romer, who's now World Bank chief economist, has a wonderful paper called The Trouble with Macroeconomics. If you haven't seen it, download it. It's brilliant. And like he says things like mainstream models effectively have a gremlin that sets prices, a troll that varies the wage markup, an ether that determines people's desire to invest. It's really an incredible put down.
Yeah, but so you've got the students behind you, you've got some mainstream economists behind you now as well, but the main policies, they're still stuck in this neoclassical
that's the trouble,
models
yeah.
and policies. And why would this be? Where's the resistance coming from? Because it's 8 years since this massive event of financial crisis, and we're still stuck in this thinking.
I think we'll be stuck there for about another 20 years if you look at the way that Japan's gone, because because a large part of neoclassical theory is saying that capitalism works best with the smallest possible government, and the whole argument again that governments should be getting involved as little as possible, and DSG, what's called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, which are the mainstream mathematical models these days, they have no role for a fiscal government. They've got a role for a central bank varying the interest rate, but that's it. So the mindset that the government should try to minimise its intervention in the economy and best have a balanced budget at all times, that mindset permeates academic economics. A lot of them are now breaking away from it, and obviously Krugman doesn't agree with it. But what you see amongst the politicians is this is what they've absorbed. And most of the politicians do what they call philosophy, politics and economics, a PPE degree. They get just enough economics to be dangerous because they learn the first year stuff and swallow it. And then the whole argument is, well, the smaller the government is better, and a responsible government is one that runs a surplus. And they have this household analogy for the role of the government. And my point is that the government is not like a household, it's like a bank.
Yes.
It's one of two ways to create money. And if you don't let them create money by spending more than they take back in taxation, you have to rely upon the private banking system to create the money, and you therefore get private debt bubbles.
Great. We'll move on to the private debt in a bit. For now, I think it would be good to see if there's an audience question on the critique on the mainstream economics. At this point.
I mean, if you didn't get anything, please ask. I mean,
I don't bite, unless you want me to.
no questions whatsoever.
One
oh yeah,
okay.
How does growth figure in your models? Because you're saying that you need the government to step in for a stimulus, but you might question whether growth is sustainable as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is another huge hole, and not just in neoclassical economics. Post-Keynesian economics also has no real decent appreciation of the role of the relationship between economics and the environment. And even ecological economics hasn't yet built a proper relationship. We have to have a systemic way of thinking about our impact upon the biosphere. And economics in the idea of general equilibrium was a very primitive way of trying to build like systems thinking, but it left out the whole role of the impact of the economic output on the ecology. So I'm now working with people like Bob Ayres to try to build a combined economic and ecological model of the economy, of the environment we're in. And in that case, you invert the status rather than seeing the ecology as something which you can manage by getting the prices right, which really is saying the ecology is a subset of the economy. It's the other way around. The economy is a subset of the ecology, and we have to see that the ecology sets the constraints within which we can operate, and we've clearly breached those constraints, except if you're Donald Trump.
I think it's time to move over to the private debt issue and get that clear.
Yes.
Chris.
So one of your main critics on mainstream economists is that they couldn't properly predict the financial crisis because they didn't properly understand the concept of private debt.
Yeah.
Could you, and to you this is the root of all evil pretty much, could you explain to the audience or give a definition of what you see under private debt?
Well, the basic thing is if you think about lending and you say banks are intermediaries, then debt is actually something one individual owes to another person. So it's not actually, it doesn't thump on the books of the banks at all. And if you dramatically vary how much debt exists, then if there's much more debt, then debtors have got more money to spend and creditors have less. And if there's people pay the debt down, then creditors have got more and debtors have got less. And overall, the aggregate just varies very moderately. But if you see the banks actually originate loans, and what a bank does, it says, that you've got a great idea buying a house in Amsterdam, sure, here's €1 million. And by the way, you owe us €1 million. So the fact that you can buy the property is generated by the asset of the bank rising. So it's rather than being like a seesaw now, where it's an elevator.
It basically bets on its own asset, is what
Effectively,
you're saying.
but it actually generates demand. When you borrow money from a bank, you don't borrow because you like being in debt. Okay? No. You borrow because you want to buy something. Yeah. So the total demand in the economy is then the sum of the turnover of existing money, which is that velocity times money argument, plus the change in debt. Because the change in debt, that credit, creates additional expenditure.
The change in debt is credit, just to get it clear.
Yeah, that's very important. The change, we're still defining terms properly, but the change in debt is credit. Okay? And that change in debt, as well as becoming extra expenditure at the aggregate level, is also additional income at the aggregate level or capital gains.
And this is debt held by households and corporates?
Yeah, households, corporates, and non-financial. There can be non-bank financial institutions as well. The trouble is, unfortunately, the data is dreadful. The actual data itself mixes banks and non-banks together. So I don't use financial sector debt just because the data is really bad. But it's basically household debt and non-financial corporation debt that I've been using the numbers for.
Okay. So we know debt more as public debt, the debt of governments.
Yeah.
The EU actually has a maximum of a 3% deficit in order to keep that public debt down. You seem to argue that private debt is way more important. But what is we got the definition, but what is the main danger of private debt?
The main danger of private debt is you can't pay it back because you don't own your own bank that lets you do it. And people, when you have a rising level of, there's two dangers. When you have rising private debt, that actually gives you rising demand. So you get two sources of demand, turnover of existing money plus credit. As the credit grows, you're also growing more debt liabilities to the bank. Now, if you get to the point where the amount of leeway you have between your total income and the part you have to devote to paying that debt becomes less than zero, expenditure crashes. Right. So the credit demand can disappear overnight. And like the most extreme example in Europe was Spain, where when the crisis began, the credit, which was 40% of GDP in the final year, 1 year later it was about minus 15%. So you had an incredible plunge in demand. There's much more volatility to demand based on credit than there is demand based on turnover of existing money. If you imagine your own personal situation, this is one of the times when your personal situation does scale to the aggregate, because a lot of economics is saying what applies to the individual doesn't apply at the aggregate. But because banks are creating money injecting it into the economy rather than being a reshuffling of the money in the economy, it does scale. So if you're spending like 110% of your income every year, and that 10% was going on your credit card, when you hit your credit card limit, that's it. So suddenly your demand goes from being 110% of your income, which everybody loves you in the street because you're always shopping, suddenly, bang, you're not using your credit card and your demand falls by 10%.
Yeah. Okay.
But private debt is also, it also equals investment into the economy. So at what point in time does private debt go from a positive thing to a danger?
I mean, this is Schumpeter's arguments about the role of the banking sector, and it is something which can be creative, because if banks were lending to entrepreneurs, then Schumpeter defined entrepreneurs as people with a good idea but no money.
Right.
Okay? And in that case, to turn the idea into something real, you've got to borrow the money. And he saw that as being the role of the banking sector. If the banking sector actually did that, then it would be a major form of demand for investment. And if you look at the empirical data again, of all people, Fama and French, who are two of the main fighters for conventional finance theory, they found in a couple of studies they did around the year 2000 that the correlation of change in corporate debt, so corporate credit, with investment was 0.79 across the whole. They had the CompuStat database, which has about 5,000 companies in it, a huge database. They could actually analyse at the corporate level, and said by far the major determinant of corporate investment is credit, corporate credit.
Right.
So that's the creative role of that bank lending. The trouble is twofold. One is that of course, banks.
But this is when it gets dangerous. Is what
Banks lend primarily to finance asset speculation these days.
Right.
They're not financing that, and that of course is unproductive. By making a house more expensive, you don't make it create more children.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just creates a asset increase.
An asset bubble, and which then bursts, and then you're in big trouble.
Right.
But also, even if they were just financing normal investment, you still can get, because this is Minsky's major point, because people make investment by projecting ahead current situations and getting euphoric as you have a period of stability, you can end up firms taking on more debt than they can actually service in the future and have a crunch coming out of that as well.
Okay, but just to get it clear, when does it lead to a true financial crisis?
When you have a private debt level exceeding about 150% of GDP.
Okay, but I mean, if it's still growing, then you will still have the demand to sort out your issue.
It'll have to crunch.
At what time will it collapse?
Well,
what is the trigger?
The triggers being multiple. The main trigger is actually, when I look at this at the purest level, it's a redistribution of income caused by the dynamics of change over time. So if you imagine a boom starting with a, say, set level of debt, and you have a crisis in the immediate past, so everybody's quite conservative, both banks and borrowers are conservative, then as the stable times go on, people get more euphoric, they're more willing to borrow money to do that. When they borrow money, at the time, you would have a drop in workers' bargaining power because of a slump, a drop in raw materials prices because the boom's over. So you start with low wage costs, low material costs, and the boom takes off. Now, as the boom takes off, first of all, you're paying more money to bankers, so the distribution of income goes from capitalists to bankers that way. Then as the boom really gets into train, the workers get more bargaining power, raw material prices rise. So at the peak of the boom, capitalists have, the whole process of changed the distribution of income. They made their estimations of what they could repay based on the distribution of income when the boom began. Several years later, the boom's in train, the distribution is not as good as they thought. So they can't quite repay the debts.
Right.
And they're down to get a slump.
That's the issue.
And
So
that's the turning point.
Yeah.
That's a turning point, and that's like I've
mathematically
mathematically modelled a very, very simple model. You get cycles out of that, which you have a series of booms and slumps, and each time it's a bit like I describe it being like a ratcheting effect. You go up in debt, you come down, and the next boom starts from a high level of debt, and the next one, and the next one, and then finally get to the point where, with the distribution of income being changed by the boom, when that hits.
Right. Okay.
And how would you explain why hasn't this caught the attention of the policymakers? Because we always hear public debt everywhere, but why hasn't this?
Again, because they've been brainwashed by a conventional way of thinking that doesn't see private debt as mattering. And this is, again, that's why the neoclassical economics is so dangerous. It says, look, that's really dangerous as you get shot from this end. You know, they don't even know they're distracting you from the real danger.
Right.
Like you read Paul
They
Krugman on
actually
this one.
believe it.
They actually believe it. It's not, they're sincerely wrong.
Yeah. Maybe it's time for an audience question on this private debt. It's maybe a lot to take in. Does any one of you have a question regarding private debt? Just none.
One over here. Yeah.
Wasn't it true that during the financial crisis we saw that public debt was like the main issue? If we look at Greece and everything, it's public debt, right? So, or is it still private debt? I don't see the relations there. For example, with Greece.
Well, for
the
example,
Eurozone crisis.
For example, with Greece, Greece doesn't have its own currency.
Yeah.
Okay. So they're totally crippled by the fact that it can't create its own currency, and also, Greece is the perfect example you want to use if you want to say it's all the fault of the debtors. Okay. For a start, they disguised the amount of public debt they had to get into the euro. They said they had about 70%. They actually had about 100% at the time. The figures will now see revised figures. Why did they do that? Twofold. One, because the European Union wanted them to do it. The European Union wanted Greece as a sort of buffer between them and the Middle East. Okay? They actually wanted Greece inside. They were willing to turn a blind eye to the fact that they knew they were being bullshitted to by Greece. Okay? So there's the complicity by the European Union in the fact that Greece got let in with those appalling situations. But Greece has also got lovely little things like shipping magnates don't pay tax. Yeah? Maybe it's a mess. Your best example is Spain. Because Spain did everything right.
Let's look,
Spain, the only country to actually achieve the Maastricht targets was Spain. Germany doesn't achieve it. Germany was there for 6 months. For 6 months, Germany had less than 60% of GDP as its government debt level. So Spain was the only one. It got down to about 30%. While that was happening, private debt went from about 100% of GDP to 240%. And that's why the Spanish could pay their public debt down, because there was a boom going on.
And they all moved it to private debt.
Well, they think there's so much revenue coming into the Spanish treasury from the property sales and that sort of tax revenue and falling unemployment, they could pay their public debt down. Right. Then the crisis hits, and of course they're cactus.
But after the crisis hit, I think the euro crisis, the issue was that they took on the public debt was basically, it increased due to the government's taking on the private debt. That was the cause.
That also helped. I mean, that happened.
And they had to bail out the banks, so they took the private debt into their own public debt.
Yeah, but what they should have let the banks fail.
Right.
We should have nationalised the banks, and then they should have gone into receivership.
Right.
And that's what happened in many ways in the 1930s, which helped actually reduce the level of private debt back then.
Okay. Let's then look at the solutions to this massive issue as you propose it, private debt. We now have quantitative easing done by the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi.
Yeah.
They buy bonds of the banks in order to pump up their reserves and hope that will trickle down to the basic people. Basically, that's the theory. You seem to believe that people's QE or helicopter money is more effective. What exactly entails? What does it mean, people's QE?
Well, okay, for the start, the very idea that banks can lend reserves shows how little economists know about banking, because it's physically impossible to lend that money.
Yeah.
And let's explain it. What they think is the model they teach is this money multiplier thing. And poor bloody Obama, I think, can now ruse the day he would chose Summers and Co. as advisors. He actually used the money multiplier as an argument for the TARP program back when he spoke to the public back in 2009. And the idea is that banks get reserves and they hang on to 10% of it and lend out 90, and then that's deposited and so on. That defies the laws of accounting. You cannot lend from reserves.
No.
But
they have. I mean, quantitative easing is not only to pump. Is it only to pump up the reserves then?
Well, no. What the quantitative easing does do is create. If the central bank buys assets off the private banks, then it does just pump up reserves.
Yeah.
But it then encourages those private banks to try to buy assets. And of course, when they buy the assets, those reserves turn up in another bank's account, so it doesn't change the reserve level, but it puts pressure on asset prices.
So it only stays at the banks.
That's if they buy off banks. They also, in some cases, buy off pension funds, superannuation funds, insurance companies, and so on. That creates money. That actually, because those organisations put their money in private banks. But when they do that, of course, what do they do with the money? They rebuy assets. It inflates asset prices.
Right.
Now, a small amount of that dribbles into the real world because they pay themselves fees for doing that, and then with the fees they go and buy Lamborghinis and get some of us to wash the mirrors, and then with that basis some of the money turns up in the real economy. But it's an incredibly inefficient way to get money circulating where you actually want it.
So your way, people's QE is more efficient. Explain to us how people QE then would work.
Well, the simplest way would be for the government to use it for infrastructure programs, which is what a lot of people have been talking about. They'd fund infrastructure programs, buy goods and services off people.
The central banks loan prints money, is what you say.
Effectively, it's a fiscal operation combined with a central bank operation. For the government what the government would do, what the central bank would do is put money to people's private bank accounts.
The central bank or the government?
My proposal is the central bank doing it, but
Okay.
it still involves effectively,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so the central banks prints money, the government gives it out to the people, and
Yeah.
they spend it, is basically what you're saying. But
Or
how
to pay off the loans.
I would
pay off the
actually,
debt.
I have the added requirement that I'd want people to me the problem is private debt being too high.
Yeah.
So you've got to reduce it. The government can create money and effectively cancel credit-based money and make it fiat-based money. So I'd say anybody who you make an equal distribution across the population.
Yeah, fiat money being money that isn't like the gold standard.
That's right. It's created by it's government-backed money.
Yeah.
Put that into people's bank accounts on a per capita basis. Anybody who had debt has to pay their debt down, but savers, people who didn't go into debt, get a cash injection.
Right.
So that way you don't benefit one group over the other.
You haven't got the moral hazard argument.
No moral hazard. What you do have is a way of reducing asset prices and enabling people who didn't lever their way up in the previous bubble.
So some pay off their debts. That
Yeah.
reduces private debt, but still, that would. I mean, what sum are we talking about here to reduce that significant? You want to? What is your? Just the first question. What is your ideal level of private debt?
I'd say it's something in the order of between 50 and 100% of GDP.
Right. It is now in most countries around 200.
200%.
Right.
We've well and truly, we need to reduce it by that much. And if
I
you look
mean,
back to the Great Depression, that's what we did do back in the Great Depression, with the small help of the Second World War.
Yeah, well, significant help. But to reduce it from 200 to, let's say, 70,
Yeah.
you need the entire GDP to. How are you going to get it to the people? In
Well,
the United States, you're talking about $70 trillion.
I wouldn't do it in one go. I'd test it. Okay, but I'm not somebody who believes my theories are necessarily going to work in practice. So I'd try a small injection initially, and you have to also stop banks funding asset bubbles after that. You've got to change the rules of lending, so I'd do that as well. But definitely, if you look at what happened during the Great Depression, I really don't know the history as well as I should, but part of the Great Depression in America involved a bank holiday. Now that bank holiday, banks were shut down, books were checked incredibly carefully, banks that were non-viable were shut down, the depositors moved elsewhere, and that was a huge part of the process of starting to write down the level of debt.
Right.
We need a similar process now.
Okay. Isn't the banking system now too complicated to do such checks? We have securitization, offshore accounts, all those things make it almost impossible.
Incredibly difficult, and you'd need to have a very intelligent organisation organising, and I'm happy to help. But
the banks are always more motivated to.
The banks.
Be
The funny,
smart, right?
banks actually listen more to me than the politicians do.
Right.
Because they're trying to make money out of all this stuff. And a lot of people in the financial sector genuinely have good motives, without a doubt. They're critical of their own businesses. So they actually listen, and they're aware of all those complications. It would be an incredibly complicated thing. You'd have to have laws in place for it as well, because actually repaying some debts more rapidly than you've contracted to actually breaches the debt covenant. So you've got all sorts of bombs like that sitting in the system.
Yeah. And you're such a proponent of empirical evidence yourself, you said. Has this happened in the past? Have you based this on any empirical evidence?
Debt jubilees were a common event in pre-capitalist societies. And this is something, if you look at the collapse of the Roman Empire, again, I've got to defer to people who know more about this than I do, but people like Michael Hudson, a good friend of mine. Yep. Michael says that the beginning of the collapse of the Roman Empire was the victory of the creditors over the debtors to end the regular experience of the burning of the books of debt. If you've ever been to the Forum in Rome, I'm so sorry I had a lousy camera when I went there, inside the Senate House you will see a fresco of the burning of the books of debt.
Right.
It was a regular occurrence.
A bonfire. And
a bonfire. Write them all off, start all over again. And that was a common part of the resetting of these pre-capitalist societies right up until the Middle Ages at various times.
But I would like to go back to your people's QE and how it would look like.
Yeah.
I mean, putting on the printing press, wouldn't it create a sort of addictive behavior of the governments that every time they have a certain debt level, they think, oh, we just put on the printing press and all will be solved?
Well, for starting, because it's an electronic printing press we're talking about now, that's one of the reasons I think that the economists in general have made this scare campaign about governments running out of money, because they did, in some sense, know that governments did have this capacity just to create as much money as they desire. And they go, politicians are irresponsible, let's tell them a fairy story that'll top them doing it. And then ultimately economists also believe their own fairy story. So that's partly the issue. And that's one reason
Yeah,
that
but still, you have to deal with a lot of inflation as well. I mean, how are you kind of? I mean, you don't just write off all debt. You give people money that I mean, the savers have still money to spend. We talk about enormous sums here. This will just inflate the economy, won't it?
And we've got empirical evidence of that from. We've seen
the
that
Weimar Republic.
No, that's actually, no, you've got empirical evidence of Germany having its heart ripped out of it and told to repay reparations.
Right. How about Venezuela?
Every time that's happened, again, I'm not an expert on this, but friends of mine that I defer to confirm, including the most recent example of Zimbabwe.
And Venezuela as well right now.
Venezuela, but it's normally destruction of productive resources as well at the same time. It's not just the monetary side of things.
But so you're saying it won't create significant inflation?
It probably will create inflation. That's what central banks are trying to do right now and failing abjectly.
Yeah, they are, but I mean, okay, fair enough. But still, it's as soon as it turns up to more than 10% or so, we've got a serious problem.
Well, in fact, when I look at what actually causes inflation, in the way that I model the economy, it's when money wage demands exceed growth and labour productivity.
No, just
to get the money wage demands exceed growth and labour productivity. Right. That's the basic force giving you inflation. So you'd need to get full enough employment to cause that effect.
Right.
Okay. We are still so far from that point.
Are we? I mean, the Fed argues that they are at full employment.
Yeah, and I mean, this is another case of believing your own bullshit. I published these. If you go to there's a wonderful database called FRED, Federal Reserve Economic Data, maintained by the St. Louis Fed, and they have as well as having the unemployment rate, they also have what's called the employment rate.
Yeah.
Now, if the story was consistent, they'd both be giving you, obviously matching trends.
Right.
Unemployment rate before the crisis, 4.6%. Yeah. Unemployment now, 4.6%.
Yeah.
Employment rate before the crisis, 80.1. Employment rate now, 78%. Okay. There's a huge divergence. The reason is
3 percentage points, right?
Pardon?
Is what you're saying.
2 million people.
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay, let's put it in numbers.
But put it in numbers. The population of America is over 300 million.
Yeah, but the working population, I'm talking between 25 and 54.
Okay.
So 20, and these are the people who voted Trump.
Yeah.
Okay? People between the ages of 25 and 54 are not still at university and they're not retiring. Okay. And there's been a demographic change that reduced that cohort by 1 million, but there's still 2 million people that had jobs before the crisis who don't have them now.
Okay,
and so if you go back to 2000, it's 4 million people.
Yeah, so just to get the story clear, people's QE will give people money. The people who owe debt have to repay that first.
Yeah.
People who don't, they can just spend it, and that will increase inflation, but not significantly. Is what basically what you're arguing.
You test it. You see how far it goes.
Yeah, okay, you test it. Okay, you hope so. Okay, fair enough.
At this point, are there any questions on the people's QE? Any other solutions to the problem of private debt?
Yeah. Quite a few on this one.
Question about private debt and QE. Sorry.
Try that one again, please.
Yeah, I think I understand that private debt increase leads to an increase in GDP, but that at the same time that's difficult to sustain or impossible to sustain. So therefore we need helicopter money. But my question then is it sustainable, or can you have growth without an increase in private debt or helicopter money, or in a monetary capitalist system, do we need either helicopter money or private debt sort of, well?
Yeah, you've got two ways to create money. In a closed economy, there's two ways. Either the banks create it by lending out more than they get back in repayments, or the government creates it by spending more than it gets back in taxation. Okay? So long as you have this expansion, then the money supply grows. At the same time, we have to be slightly more realistic about what money is, because money fundamentally is promises. Government promises we automatically accept. Bank promises we also accept. But if we continue accepting more bank promises, then our liabilities to the bank rises as well. So partly that creation of debt is banks abusing a privilege that their promises are used to enable transactions to occur. And by those promises, they get ownership of assets. And if they get too much ownership of the assets, you have a financial crisis. So once you realise that money is not like gold or not something you have to save to be able to lend out, this is both governments and banks can both create it from nothing just through double entry bookkeeping. Once you realise that, you realise we have to occasionally reset those books as well. So in that sense, jubilees are a necessary thing on a permanent basis. And what you don't want to have is have the financial sector being as strong as it is now. Finance, as Marx once said, is a great servant and a lousy master. And we've let the finance sector get so big that it's the master of the capitalist system, and that's why capitalism at the current is screwed, because the wrong master's in charge.
Right. I see another audience question. We got time for one more, and then we move on to predictions on the financial crisis.
This is a familiar face from one of my favorite videos.
Thank you, sir. I have a question. You say that believing your own bullshit is a big blockade towards people's QE.
Yeah.
Would you say there are any big vested interests that are also in the way, apart from ideology?
Yeah, huge. I mean, for example, the finance sector, if the programs I want to bring about actually happen, the finance sector would shrink by a factor of 3.
Yeah, it would just basically, I mean, you say banks should go bankrupt and just
Well, they wouldn't go bankrupt because they have less income earning capacity. If you think about what QE would do, their loans would go down, their reserves go up. Okay? What they have is far less income earning assets, so the bonuses they like paying each other and so on disappear. One of the instructive little events for me in arriving in London was went out with one of my Twitter contacts. His wife was at the dinner as well, and I asked what she did. And he said, she used to earn more in the finance sector than I do. And I said, what do you do now? I'm a school teacher. Why are you a school teacher? I got sick of the stress in finance, so I thought I'd go a less stressful job like being a school teacher, at which point I burst out laughing. And she said, you're dead right, it's just as much stress to be a school teacher, but at least I believe in what I'm doing now. But she also said her first paycheck when it turned up, not including her bonus, was 1/30th of what she was earning in the finance sector. Right. That means her salary was about £750,000 a year in finance, because a first-year art teacher gets £25,000. Now we're talking, that's ridiculous. Yeah. Salaries in finance should be down at about the, one-tenth of that. Yeah. So if you think about the impact of what I'm trying to do, a lot of people would get a lot less money, and I think I'd need to take out insurance myself.
Okay, quickly moving on to the last part. You're quite notorious on your predictions on which countries are next to experience a financial crisis. To name a few: China, Australia, Sweden, Hong Kong, Korea, Canada, and Norway. Quite a list. One of your own, or like your own home country, Australia, is one of them, and you've predicted that they would have experienced a big housing bubble burst a few years ago, that would happen. And then just a few days ago, we've read in the news that Australia suffered a decline in GDP in 2 consecutive quarters, which to some is the definition.
Not quite, there's only one so far.
Oh, okay, it was one quarter. Okay. Do you think this is your prediction coming true? Is this due to the private debt level?
I think it's inevitable. The reason Australia avoided the crisis back in 2008 was it borrowed its way out of it. It encouraged people back into the housing market with they had a thing they called the first home owners boost, and I called it the first home vendors boost, because they doubled and trebled the amount of money the government gave to first home buyers. And in fact, a first home buyer in Victoria could get $35,000 from the government when the average house price was I would think about that stage about $300,000. So a huge amount of money from the government, which just pushed first-home buyers in there. So when the crisis began, I think Australia's private debt level on BIS figures is about 180% of GDP. It's now 210%. So that increase in credit is what kept them going through the crisis. Now they've got to the stage where when they start turning down, they're turning down from a far higher level of debt than they would have done back at the financial crisis itself. So they inevitably have to have a downturn, and I think it's happening right now.
And this isn't due to anything else, such as a reduction in public spending, or?
Oh, that's partly the politicians will react in the wrong way, which I'm totally looking forward to, because the current Prime Minister is he's a decent enough narcissist. He's a nicer narcissist than the one who runs America. But he believes he can solve all problems, and he's about to cause them, which I'm going to thoroughly enjoy. So they will probably cut back government spending in the first belief that that's going to make the economy better. So they're going to make it worse initially before it gets better.
Again, austerity is what we'll be seeing in Australia.
They
haven't learned anything from Europe.
We've got to deregulate this and got to cut that, and they'll do that stuff, and it'll get worse, and then there'll be real fun. And I'd really love to see how they start interrogating the Treasury economists at that stage.
Okay, but it's mainly due to the private debt, the credit decreasing, therefore aggregate demand and the whole housing bubble, it will burst.
Plus the other
is
stuff,
it what we see now, or is it the public debt? Just to get it clear, is your prediction now coming true? Is this the first signs that recession is hitting due to this?
I think so. I mean, the thing is, the government can always try to encourage private borrowing again. So the first thing they did was by encouraging first-home buyers back into the market in 2008. What they did, again, mainly the Reserve Bank did in 2012, they started cutting rates, hoping that it would cause a housing bubble. And Australian interest rates are still 1.5%, the reserve rate. So they've still got room to continue pumping that bubble up. And I think they will do that. So they could delay it for a while. But inevitably, they're getting to the point where they're going to run out of means to encourage people into
But America had as well, that they couldn't find any credible homeowners to lend it out to.
Yeah, they'd already screwed themselves completely on that front.
So when will it happen? Will it be before 2020?
Oh, before 2020. I said absolutely before 2020. Probably, I said with the book I finished writing about 2 months ago, I said probably in 2017.
It will happen.
Yeah.
So these are the first signs, and it now will come crashing down, is what you predict.
I hope so.
How big will it be?
I think the economy could hit the similar sorts of unemployment that America hit.
Right.
Of the order of 10%.
Right.
The figures themselves are just as dodgy in Australia as they are as America, unfortunately. They define, if you say you haven't looked for work in the last 2 weeks, you're not unemployed, okay? You're just out of the workforce. So on the other figures, there's a couple of statisticians who maintain figures on true employment rates, and they're recording rates of 9% right now.
Okay.
So I can certainly see that going above 12, 15%. The formal rate could hit 8 to 10%.
And if you look at the global perspective, not only Australia, how big will this impact be on Europe, on America?
The countries that are identified as having avoided the crisis by borrowing their way through it account for between about 30% of global GDP.
So if they all fall at once, if it all
it'll be like America.
It will be
but it won't be all at once. I mean, because
Okay.
China is one of those countries, by far the largest one, of course.
Yeah.
And China can switch from private funding to public without us even knowing it.
Okay.
A large part of the aid projects in Kazakhstan and places like that are actually exporting their unemployment effectively by putting Chinese workers in Chinese factories at work, building facilities outside China. So they can, but they've got to have a housing crunch as well. So in total, we're going to see a large amount of demand from the global economy disappear.
Okay.
And just another example that we were quite surprised about, Norway.
Yeah.
Why Norway? I mean,
it's got again, I can't recall the exact figures, but I think they've got a private debt level of about 220% of GDP.
Yeah, but they also have a reserve of 900 billion?
Yeah, but they can't access that to pay their housing debt. It's simply the large part of the demand in the economy is based on credit. And then when you get to a high level of private debt and you've got a large amount of credit as well, which is growth of private debt, then if that growth of private debt stops, a large part of your demand disappears. So it's just that if you rely upon credit demand and it's a huge part of total demand, then if it stops, there's a slump in demand, even if GDP itself keeps on growing.
So their capital buffer from the oil and gas reserves cannot be spent to use the...
No, they could decide later to use those for infrastructure projects or other activities like that, and they probably will. But in my figures, definitely going to face a drop in credit demand, which will then cause a recession.
Okay. I think we've almost run out of time. Maybe one final audience question on the predictions of Professor Keane regarding future financial crises. Any? If not, okay, then it will be us. So what will be the first of those countries? We just named a few. What will be the first? Will it be Australia?
Australia and Canada were the two. They're almost Siamese twins. They've both been resource-based economies, and the resource demand is falling for both of them. They've both had housing bubbles, and they're falling over. They've both got Chinese demand providing a large part of the housing demand as well, and China may well actually pull that demand out because Xi is trying to stop a capital exodus from China right now. So triple whammies all at once will hit those economies. Then another one is Belgium.
Okay.
Belgium's massive.
What time span are we talking about? And what is the volume? What is the scale we're talking about?
In terms of the time scale, it's any time in the next 3 years.
Right. For all those three countries.
Yeah, I can't see them going past 2020 without a serious crunch.
Okay.
And then in terms of the scale, because they're all roughly 10 to 20% of GDP is their credit demand level, If that disappears, then you're talking, about, let's say, 10% of the demand of 30% of the global economy, 3 to 5% of global demand disappears.
Okay.
Well, we'll invite you back in 3 years to see if that's...
We will. So it will, just to round up, we've run out of time, but will it take a new generation of economists to finally see those issues of private debt?
I think it will. I mean, you can't rely upon the current generation changing their mind.
Okay.
But the new generation has opened to new ways of thinking, and there's a whole range of technologies which were developed by non-economists, system dynamics, complex systems analysis, and so on, high-powered computing, multi-agent simulations, all that stuff is available, and young people know about it because they play computer games.
Yeah.
So it's feasible for the new generation to bring in the wisdom that exists in other areas like cliometrics, like mathematical biology, like complex systems, and finally bring that stuff into economics and throw away the
So it will be
nonsense.
this audience that will change
It better bloody well be, or I'll come back in 3 years' time and berate you.
Okay. On that note, it's time to end. Before we give a round of applause to Professor Keen, let me make some final remarks that we have an interview next week on Wednesday at 1, the 14th of December with Thierry Baudet on European politics and Dutch politics. It's in Dutch, though, so beware. And then a final remark for Rethinking Economics. Professor Keen will be speaking on Monday, the 12th of December at 8. He will be talking about how to reform our current curriculum of economics.
Inspire 25.
Yeah, Inspire 25 in Amsterdam. All right, that's all. Thanks for coming, and please give a warm hand for Professor Keen.
Thank you.